Good afternoon to all of you and a very warm welcome. So we are very close to SMU, as Professor Pasha just reminded us, and we take advantage of that closeness to continue our excellent collaboration with the Singapore Management University and really picking on themes of common resonance between the EU, Singapore, and SMU. So thank you very much for having us here again. Greatly appreciative of our audience that is present here. My name is Deepika Shetty. I'm the press officer at the European Union Delegation to Singapore, and it's my honor and privilege to be your MC for today's proceedings. Our lecture today offers an EU perspective on competition policy as a driver of economic integration. During the course of this evening, the lecture will examine the pivotal role of competition policy in promoting economic integration within the European Union, referencing key insights from recent research and reports. We are, of course, very honored to have with us our special guest from Brussels, Inge Bernaerts, who's Director for Strategy and Policy in the European Commission's Directorate-General for Competition, or DG Com. To kick things off, I now warmly invite the head of the Economic and Trade section at the EU Delegation to Singapore, Philipp Dupuis, to deliver his remarks. Philipp, over to you.
Thank you, Mika. Well, good afternoon, dear professors, students, dear colleagues, dear audience. Very good afternoon, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you in the name of the European Delegation to Singapore to this guest lecture on the topic competition policy as a driver of economic integration, the EU perspective. So nobody's better placed to talk about this topic than Inge Bernaerts, the Director for Strategy and Policy of the Directorate-General for Competition of the European Commission. And Inge has landed this morning here in Singapore, and we are very pleased that she's now with us and will talk to this audience before she joins the ASEAN conference on competition tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. I would also like, of course, to thank the SMU for hosting us today, in particular Professor Hsieh. Thank you. The Yong Chair in EU-ASEAN Law and Relations, as well as Assistant Professor Yidere Molina of the Faculty of Law, and Professor Wanwei Liu, Deputy Director, Center for Digital Law. Now, competition policy is a core part of the EU single market framework, and its role is to ensure fair and open competition across EU member states. Its objective are, in particular or among others, to stop dominant companies from exploiting their position, prevent the creation of economic operators that could harm competition, and consumer choice, ensure that government subsidies do not distort the competition on the EU single market. By keeping markets competitive, consumers get better prices, higher quality, and more innovative products and services. You will hear more from Director Bernaerts in a moment. Just also to talk a little bit about our bilateral relationship with Singapore. So our trade investment relations are very strong. They are underpinned by the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which includes, among others, also a comprehensive chapter on competition. And these competition provisions in the FTA aim at promoting efficient markets and ensuring a level playing field for businesses in the EU-Singapore economic relations. They illustrate the joint objective of the EU and Singapore to uphold a strong competitive environment. Today, we already heard it, Director Bernaerts will focus our lecture on the importance of competition policy for the functioning of the EU's internal market, the second largest market in the world with 450 million consumers. Please enjoy the lecture, and we also hope for a vivid discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, students, and friends. My name is Pasha Hsieh, and I serve as Monnet Chair here at Singapore Management University Yong School of Law. and it is our pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture by Director Inge Bernaerts. And she's, of course, a leading voice in European competition policy, whose work continues to shape both the EU's economic integration and its role in the global economy. And I also need to point out that she's a lawyer, so we believe that she will bring an added depth of perspective to these important issues. So today's lecture will examine the important role of competition policy in promoting economic growth and development within the EU. Many of these important issues carry significant implications for Singapore and ASEAN. So against this background, the Director Bernaerts' insights are especially timely. And following her lecture, the Q&A session will be chaired by my colleague, Professor Anidia Remolina. We look forward to an engaging discussion and to learning from her expertise. So with this in mind, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Director Inge Bernaerts.
I landed this morning and I thought there was no better way to fight fatigue and jet lag than to engage with you as students and to be back in law school, actually, for a couple of hours. What takes me to Singapore here today is the 11th competition conference of the ASEAN region, where I'll be talking tomorrow about pretty much the same topics as we'll be discussing today, about competition policy as an enabler for growth and for economic integration in the context of today's challenges. And I will very much there and here bring a European dimension to this question. But I will also later this week take part in the 20th anniversary celebrations of the Competition and Consumer Council of Singapore. And I can say that that's a very well-respected and well-regarded competition agency amongst our large community of national competition agencies from all over the world in the international competition network. So what I would like to start with is a little bit of history. Don't worry, not too much history. But just a couple of points, because I think they're still very relevant to understand also what drives our competition policy today, and perhaps what can be relevant about the EU's experience for other regions across the world. Competition provisions are really a central piece in the social market economy that is enshrined in the founding treaties of the European Union. And when our founding fathers in the end of the 50s of the last century wrote down the treaty provisions, it's really amazing on how they wrote only a handful of basic articles in those treaties that still serve us so well today, and serve us not only well in the European Union, but have served also as a source of inspiration for other competition regimes all across the world, including here in Asia. It is important that these provisions are provided for in the founding treaties, because for lawyers that you are in the room, this means that it are provisions of primary law nature that have very special meaning in our legal order. What is important as well is that the role of enforcing the competition rules was entrusted straight in the founding treaties to the European Commission. And this is important to understand because it was as if member states, remember, who were just coming out of 50 years with two very serious wars on the continent of Europe. It is important because member states, in a way almost to control their own demons, knew that they had to create a supranational order and a supranational body that somehow could control their basic instincts when they would turn negative again. And that's clear, for example, in our state aid provisions, where the European treaties provide that member states shall not subsidize in a selective way their own industry in a way that distorts the internal market. But it is important also in the way the Commission has the powers to challenge national monopoly rights that member states create for their own companies, because they too hinder the internal market. The internal market has really been a key engine of growth in the European Union. It started, of course, with the European Union of 6 member states that grew to 12, 15, and 28, at some point now 27 member states after the UK left the European Union. And that internal market has brought a lot of economic growth by removing barriers to cross-border trade. And the internal market has delivered economic growth and welfare to EU citizens. And when 20 years ago the EU enlarged from 12, 15 member states to then 28, we realized that for the Commission to be the only enforcer of competition rules in the EU would not be effective, because we saw that, of course, certain markets are global, certain mergers that we analyze are global mergers, but a lot is also still happening in national markets. Some markets think about basic groceries, but think also about telecommunication services. Energy markets remain very much national in scope. And competition in those national markets within our member states, a level playing field as we call it in those member states, has a relevance for the entire European economy and for chances of businesses in other member states to spread their activities across borders. And that's why in 2004, actually, we adopted a new regulation whereby the Commission shares its enforcement powers of the EU competition rules with national authorities in the member states. And we created a closely knit network of European competition agencies. It is, of course, specific to the European Union that is, if you like, a federal system whereby the European Commission always has the power to take over cases from national competition authorities, and where we also look at the draft decisions that the national authorities want to adopt to make sure that we have a consistent interpretation and application of the competition rules across the entire European Union. What I would like to briefly touch on today is the importance of competition as an enabler for economic growth. Innovation and growth are on everybody's mind nowadays, and not least also in the European Union. We had last year 2 important reports that were issued, one by Enrico Letta, former Prime Minister of Italy, and one by Mr. Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank. And Mr. Draghi in particular made a quite harsh analysis of problems in the European Union, because he said that we are not yet fully tapping into all the potential of the internal market, because there remain too many barriers also within Europe in that internal market, and that was hampering growth and implied that there was not always enough productivity growth and innovation happening in EU industries if you compare it with other parts of the world, the US, but also certain parts of Asia. And that put a new focus on competition policy. On the one hand, as an enabler to remove some of, or as an instrument, as a sword, if you like, to remove some of these remaining obstacles to cross-border consolidation of businesses and spreading of their activities, but also as an enabler of efficiency in our economies. Now, this is a little bit of economic jargon on the slide, but if you ask economists about the benefits of competition policy, they very much highlight how competitive markets really spur businesses to keep on innovating in order to gain market shares. When you are exposed to competition, you cannot sit in your and rest on your laurels. I compare it to competing in a sports competition. If you do not train, if you do not challenge yourself to be the fittest, you will not win many races. So competition in sports and in the economy ensures that businesses continue to have the pressure to be efficient, to be innovative, to invest in better products and better services for their customers. Competition also makes sure that the means in our society, the productive means, are allocated in an efficient way. If there are inefficient firms, they are pushed out of the market by more successful firms, and that creates space for newcomers into the market with new ideas, with better ideas, and ensures that the productive means are allocated in an efficient manner between firms. In the European Union, we are strongly convinced also that effective competition at home prepares our European businesses well to compete successfully in global markets. Again, compare it to sports. If you are trained in your domestic, small-sized competitions and you train and you compete there, then you can also be a successful athlete one day at the Olympic Games. It's very hard to immediately go to the Olympics without having taken part in competitions at home. As I mentioned, we are strongly convinced, because we believe that our history and empirical analysis of that history has shown us that the macroeconomic effects of competition are such that competition is an important driver of our long-term economic growth. What is important, and here we come a little bit to the setup of the European Commission, where my department, the Directorate-General for Competition, is one of the departments of the European Commission, and therefore part of government, if you like, although there are the necessary assurances to make sure that there is also the independence, notably when we enforce our rules in specific cases. But why that is important? Because it helps us in doing what I call here on this slide the competition advocacy with other departments of the European Commission, where they put in place, for example, legislation. And the internal market in the European Union is driven also by ensuring that certain rules are set at the European level. And we were just talking about the Digital Markets Act, for example, our legislation that regulates the biggest platforms in the European economy. And that is internal market legislation. It is regulation which is set immediately at the European level instead of having regulations at 27 individual member states levels. Now you have legislation in many fields, from consumer safety products to how energy markets or telecoms markets operate, how aviation transport has been liberalized. And competition authorities, my department, played an important role in that, in putting in place such competition-enabling legislation and in identifying where there can be barriers to optimal functioning of markets. So this is, I would say, a mutual beneficial dialogue that needs to take place between competition agencies and lawmakers to ensure that laws are designed and put in place in pro-competitive manners and do not still competition. If we can move to the next slide, please. There I give you a little bit of an overview of the intensity of our enforcement action going back to the early 2000s. And you see that we take on average 28 Competition interventions per year. I have here, for the sake of simplicity, left out the state aid control and decisions, and I focus only on the antitrust decisions. This is to a large extent decisions challenging abusive unilateral conduct by dominant players, cartel cases, often secretive collusion between competitors to fix prices or reduce volumes in the market, with often very direct harm to consumers, and our merger control cases. So mergers above certain turnover thresholds need to be notified to the European Commission before they can be implemented. We carry out, within quite strict legal deadlines, an analysis to see whether such mergers would impede effective competition in the market or not. And if they do threaten to impede effective competition, then the parties have the opportunity to propose remedies. For example, they can divest a part of their business before then we clear the merger. But if such remedies are not proposed or are not available, we can also block mergers. So here you see the number of interventions. So for mergers, that means transactions that we clear either with remedies or that we prohibit. Cartel decisions and antitrust decisions. And there are on average about 28 such interventions, most of them mergers. We handle about between 300 and 400 merger transactions a year. Now, what is important is this figure on the slide, because we have invested in a department that focuses on doing ex post evaluation and calculates on the basis of best standards that have been agreed within the OECD how much consumer savings result from our competition enforcement. And I mean, there is quite a broad range in the figure that you see here, because it's not always easy to calculate exactly, but we do estimate that this is, or we do think that this is an underestimation of the real savings, because it doesn't really include the preventative effect that our enforcement actions have. So annual savings of about 12 to 20 billion euros a year, that's 18 to 30 Sing dollars a year. And if you calculate it in macroeconomic gains, then our colleagues from the Economic and Financial Department and the Joint Research Center have calculated that competition enforcement boosts the EU GDP by 0.6 and 1.1% annually. So that means between 100 and 180 billion euros in current GDP terms. I'm sure that if you were to do calculations here in Singapore or in the region, the figures would not be very far apart, at least in terms of the potential of competition enforcement. Now, in the next slide, I would like to come back to this point about competition policy as a driver of economic integration between different countries with different economies. And remember, again, the European Union started as a union of 6 member states, has 27 member states. And if you see throughout the years, then it's actually quite amazing on how quickly economic integration of these countries has happened, and how this has lifted economies upwards. And this is done by, on the one hand, as I mentioned, tackling national monopolies that were in place in these member states. Think about the utility sectors again. We used to have national telecoms monopolists until about 30 years ago, in the 90s of previous century, that actually competition legislation abolished those monopoly rights, and internal market legislation was then put in place to make it possible for telecom players to enter each other's markets. it is still unfinished business today, and it still requires hard work from us every day, and sometimes in, as you can imagine, circumstances which are not always easy. For example, right now we have a procedure that we opened against Italy because there were two banks in Italy that were merging. We had looked at the transaction from a merger control perspective. We saw that there was no competition problem as a result of that merger. The ECB, the European Central Bank, had looked at it, saw there were no problems from a prudential perspective, and still the Italian government imposed conditions on the merger that were such that the parties abandoned the merger. And we have now opened proceedings arguing that in doing so, the Italian government has violated our merger regulation. Just to show that also still in the European Union, more than 60 years after the treaties were put in place, sometimes there are tendencies to erase barriers to cross-border transactions, and sometimes even within border transactions that need to be actively challenged. What I put here on the slide as well, that competition policy is, however, not a panacea. Sometimes, especially against larger challenges in today's times, be that the fight against climate change and for a sustainable economic growth, be that to preserve social fairness in markets, or to ensure industrial policy objectives, which are high on people's minds nowadays. Sometimes there is a tendency, because competition policy is such an enabler, to then think that competition policy should solve it all. That is, of course, not the case and cannot be the case. There continues to be a need for other instruments to accompany or to be put in place as well. And competition law is sometimes a player only in the margin. Take the fight against climate change. The European Union has a strong vision that it deploys for a clean industrial deal to decarbonize also not only energy systems but also industrial processes. While competition policy can play its role by, for example, making sure that when we look at markets, at mergers that involve key technologies, that markets remain open and contestable there, or we can sanction cartels, like we imposed heavy penalties on car manufacturers a couple of years ago because they agreed to postpone the introduction of clean technologies in the market. But we can, of course, not with competition policy make the entire transition happen. That requires other measures, including climate and environmental targets, including, again, legislation. Think about energy performances of buildings. It requires also sometimes subsidies in order to address market failures and to make sure that investments can take place in a combination with public and private resources. I come to the end because I think I'm running over the time that was allotted to me, and I definitely also want to keep time to answer questions. But I want to say a couple more words about the European Competition Network, because I think it is so exceptional in its nature across the world, and it can, I think, in other parts of the world, including in Asia, perhaps serve in certain aspects as an example. Our European Competition Network, and I have in my department a special unit that basically caters and animates this network from the perspective of the European Commission. The network puts together the 27 national competition authorities of the member state. And there is a strong legal framework for the cooperation between these national authorities. And I cannot underline this enough. Again, this is law school, but legal frameworks are important. They do matter. For example, we wanted to make sure that there is a strong legal basis for authorities to exchange confidential information without the need for the undertakings that we are investigating to agree with it. So when we cooperate with third country jurisdictions, with the Singapore Authority, for example, we cannot share confidential information without a waiver from the parties. Within the European Union, we can. We can share full information from our confidential files with each other, and we don't need the undertaking's permission to do so. On the other hand, there are, of course, also strong guarantees that within the network that information is kept strictly confidential, so that it cannot be shared outside of the network, and that businesses are, of course, also sure that the confidentiality of their data is being protected. We consult with each other early on cases to see which is the authority that is best placed, and to make sure that we do not take steps which are negative for each other's enforcement actions. Let's say that we have information that suggests that there may be a secret cartel, and we want to carry out dawn raids, so investigations, unannounced inspections of the premises of those companies. If we do not coordinate it, then you can very well ruin the chances of another authority that may be looking into the same conduct. So we inform each other of that, and where we see that different authorities are looking into the same conduct, we coordinate the timing of the investigation so that we go in all at the same time. That's something that we also do internationally, by the way, sometimes. And then we coordinate on the interpretation that is given to European competition law provisions. So there it's the Commission really that has the final say, in the sense that national authorities need to inform us of their draft decisions, and we do a check to see whether they interpret the treaty provisions in a way that is consistent with our own thinking. Ultimately, of course, is the Court of Justice that is the arbiter and the ultimate interpreter of the European law provisions. And there also we have mechanisms in place where we can intervene through amicus curiae letters in proceedings of the court that concern national competition law issues. We have very regular contacts, and again, that goes in the first place from contacts on concrete cases to also exchanging sectoral expertise. We are organized in DG Competition by sectors of the economy. We have a department for transport, a department for telecoms and tech, a department for heavy industry, for example. And all of these departments also have regular meetings with the experts of national competition authorities to discuss, for example, trends in the market and novel conducts that we will be looking at. A very final word, that cooperation is not limited to the European Union. From our perspective, we're also very engaged in the international competition network, a network that was set up more than 20 years ago as a voluntary network. It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. It's really an informal network of the competition agencies, but it has a steering committee that steers the activities, has an annual conference, which is really always a highlight of the year. Next year, that will take place in Manila in the Philippines. There is the Organization also for Economic Cooperation and Development, which has a very active and lively antitrust committee that we also invest in. That committee publishes very useful guidelines and international standards in how to conduct competition investigations. And then there are the regional networks, so the ASEAN in Europe that we discussed, the ASEAN here in Asia, again, the reason of my trip to Singapore this week. There is also in Africa a large region that goes from the north all the way to the south, in the east of Africa, which is called COMESA. And as European Union, we very much like to keep close ties with those regional initiatives in other parts of the world, because we believe that for smaller countries and smaller competition agencies to work together, that strengthens them often in their own countries and strengthens their impact in the world. And last but not least, it is very important that we work closely together with our colleagues in DG Trade in this regard to have strong competition chapters in the free trade agreements that we negotiate, because level playing fields based on strong substantive competition provisions, strong process guarantees, and guarantees around the independence of the competition enforcers are, in our view, a good basis for fair trade relationships between economies. So that's why these competition chapters in free trade agreements, and the EU-Singapore agreement is no exception in that regard, are really important to us.
It's my great pleasure to host and to give a final remark. My name is Hsieh Liu. I'm the Deputy Director of Center for Digital Law at SMU School of Law. And I have lots of questions, to be honest. I practiced competition law before, but I tried not to mention that because I'm scared that I can be picked up to teach, which I could not. And I have a lot of questions about competition law is important not only for the internal market economic development per se, it's also a strategic tool to be used by many countries when industrial policies, geoeconomics, and lots of strategic calculations revive, techno-nationalisms. We see sometimes governments accuse other partners about misuse antitrust competition tools to protect and promote your national campaigns, etc. And that would be a huge issue for European unions to work with like-minded countries like Singapore to fix these issues, to promote more innovative society in the digital era. With that, I'm happy to close these sessions, and we are very delighted to host this event as SNU, and I hope the reflections today we have will inspire further thought on how competition policy can drive economic integration in EU and elsewhere. So thank you very much again for our speakers, and thank you our friends from European unions and our local friends in Singapore, SMU. Last but not least, please allow me to present a little gift. Yes.